All right. Should have come out here on scooters. All right, so we have a lot to talk about. Scooters are taking over the world, it feels like. But I want to start, so we have an interesting group here from the regulatory side, the investment side, and an operator in Lime. So I want to start by asking each of you, what's the best way to engage a city from your perspective? Because there's a lot of different strategies that different companies have taken. There's the go in and then start talking to the local government approach after you've already deployed your fleet. And then there's the approach of obviously going to the government first before you do that. So Miguel, maybe we can start with you and how you've thought about that here in Lisbon.
Well, just let me spend 30 seconds just to say that I've been hearing good things about mobility in Lisbon from people that are here in the Web Summit. And I think good things are happening because actually you are here. The ones that decided to come a few years ago, the ones that are here today, and the ones that want to stay here also because of Web Summit and believe that Lisbon is a place to innovate, to do new stuff, and want to connect to the city. Well, thank you all for that, and you are very welcome here in our city. Going to your question, I think we have to understand that for mobility, we don't need a transition. We don't need an evolution. We need a revolution. Because if you look to the Paris Agreement targets and to the UN development goals, if you don't change dramatically the habits on mobility, you will not make that change. And for that, you need innovation. And when you innovate, and scooters are innovating on mobility on the city, sometimes you have growth pains. Sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes you'll do mistakes. But we have to understand that you have to open the city to this kind of innovation and managing two critical things: quality of public space and safety. And to do it, you need to build a platform where actually you can connect between the city authorities and the operators. And you have to have this channel. If it doesn't work, if this channel doesn't work, the cities will react and ban this kind of services. And we have seen that in other cities. So the key goal is have the courage to innovate, be very clear on the red lines regarding safety and quality of public space, and be able to cooperate with operators, any that will be. We have a very good experience with Lime here. Since day one, they approached the city. They asked us how we can do together. Looking to the city, we understand that there are things that we can do better. And what's important is that we agree on those things and we move forward together. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, my perspective is, I started out as outside counsel for Uber right after their incorporation. And back then they had no GC, no outside legal team. And I remember going into the first board meeting right after the Series A financing, and I was told, okay, so we have 17 different lawsuits in 17 different cities, and this is even before they went international. And the perspective of the board and the company at that time was, ubiquity is key. First focus on ubiquity and on user acquisition and, deal with the regulatory issues later. And so that was kind of the directive from the top down that I was given and implemented. Subsequently, I think we've seen that cities have gotten smarter. This is their second time around now with micromobility. And I think the approach will have to be a little bit more cooperative. I think we're seeing that. I think scooters don't quite have the same leverage that ride-sharing companies had from just a pure convenience perspective that they're offering. I mean, eventually they will, but not quite yet. And scooters are much easier for cities to manage, right? You can just pick them up and, toss them if you need to, right? So it's easier for
toss them down on the street, maybe.
Well, and a lot of cities have been impounding scooters. So I think, cities are now taking the approach of either work with us or we're going to give permits and licenses to your competitors. And, that is creating a lot of incentive for scooter companies and bike sharing companies to, I think, work more cooperatively with cities this time. I would say the one advantage that scooters have is that so far the cities aren't outright banning them, other than a couple of cases like New York. But for the most part, it's just a question of which scooter companies are going to get the licenses and to what extent, what will the caps be, what will the regulatory regime be around that?
Yeah, I think to jump into both points there on kind of your point on how do we create a platform. I think the platform is about really understanding something that is not just a revolution, but reimagining how we work together. I think typically private companies have seen themselves as creating a service for the citizens, but not also for the city. And I think that has to be part of the way you come in day one. And it also means that you're coming in with proposals. You're not coming in with just a conversation of here's what we offer. It's here's what we think we can go and work on together with you based on what you as a city have mandates for the next 5, 10, 15 years of your own goals. And I think we've created a product which sort of from day one was always how do we align along those city needs, along those city goals, and then take out the barriers that typically prevent cities from taking those on. And when you do that, you're not coming to them with something you're trying to force in the case of an Uber situation. You're coming with them where it's meeting their needs and you've eliminated things like care for insurance. We have that. We were the first ones globally to actually create that as part of a dockless model. And when you do these things and you stand for these pillars, you ultimately create a brand that is no longer about resistance from the city, but about collaboration, about growing into sort of a longer term vision of what that can be together in a way that's no longer how do we sort of serve your people, but hey, how do we serve the greater ecosystem that is universities, that is city officials, that is the riders, that is the sort of business and corporate sort of entities as well in a very holistic way. And I think that's been part of what Lima has from day one really created its image around is you have to empower each of these and you have to work with each of these constituents to build that longer term future. And I think in some ways what Uber was able to do had short-term benefit, but has had long-term sort of effect. And I think that is where we've sort of been able to sort of learn from those who have come into a market to demonstrate in some ways the best of our learnings as well as the best of our morals and values as a company of how do we build for the long term from day one, knowing we can still win a short-term game as we've proven considering the scale at which we've grown and now reaching 20 million rides in less than 15 months.
Caen, so with Lime specifically, I'm wondering what you guys have learned in terms of how you approach working with the city. I mean, specifically if you look at San Francisco, you and Bird deployed your fleets there without there being really any permits or regulation in place. Now you're in a pretty contentious lawsuit with the city of San Francisco over the fact that they rejected your permit application. And there's 2 other companies there that are operating now legally. So what did you guys learn through that process and how you should approach cities around the world, really? Because it's also been smoother for you guys in Europe, Paris, and elsewhere. So what's the difference there?
Yeah, I mean, one, the DNA has been consistent all the way throughout. Not to go too micro into San Francisco, but we were forgoing on a year before they made any mandate about the scooter, in conversations with them, understanding what their needs were. We actually launched with support from 2 particular districts, and so we had city support. We had sort of done it under a pilot scenario. We saw others react to us and basically feel as though we'd opened the market, flood the market, and then create a reaction by the city. And we weren't actually appealing the city for us, and to be clear, we don't feel like there's ever a reason to ask for Lime to be included. We're appealing for a clear and transparent process, which had not been done previously, as you know, sort of the e-bike or bike contract, and also then on the question here. So it was more for that transparency, and just how do you meet the city's needs, and the citizens' needs, more importantly. Because what they came up with doesn't actually solve the footprint of what is the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that need to be able to commute and get around with 500 vehicles. So I think when you look at the structure of what we've tried to do, it's always been about working with cities first. And I think Paris is an example of something where that worked magnificently. We came into them early on with basically service level expectations that we said we will hold ourselves to. That without asking them, we came to them with a plan of what that could look like, how we would grow, conversations around what are the main areas we'd launch. We talked with all the respective mayors of each of the arrondissements there, as much as with the main sort of city officials and stakeholders. And I think when you engage that level and you've had the thoroughness of conversations, you're now in a conversation on how to learn from one another, and to your point, how to build that platform, rather than sort of a question of what does your service offer.
If I just may add on that topic, I think what we need to understand is what has to exist is respect. Because basically we have to understand that cities are monopolists. Cities have the full control of the public space and the quality of life that they want for their citizens. And it's okay to be a monopoly, because basically you go to voting every 4 years or so, and then you can change the board if you want to. But the point is, we have to understand that cities have all the powers. And if you put, if you have a policy like Lisbon has, let's be open to innovation, but let's put a red line, which is when you abuse of the city. And if you all understand that line, if there is respect, that's much better than regulation. Because I had the privilege to work in a lot of regulations that it was made in Portugal at the government level here, including the regulation of the shared bikes. We regulate shared bikes. We didn't remember to regulate shared scooters. because innovation just goes faster than regulation, right? So we have new products faster that you can regulate. So we have to understand is that we have to have a conversation and respect each other's roles. And if you do that, you can innovate, you can deploy new service, and you can correct what is wrong, because some things will go wrong.
Yeah.
So,
and just to play on that one thing, I think respect is a key part of it. And I think you also have to show respect by being proactive in how you're investing in the conversation. And I think, just as an example, for instance, we have what is our own Respect the Ride campaign, where ultimately we're investing more than $3 million in what is giving away helmets. All you have to do is sign a pledge for you will ride respectfully, park respectfully, and we're ultimately giving away things, exact helmets like this that you can sort of begin to ride in accordance with local regulations in the most safe way. I think cities want solutions, and they want to look for companies that are ultimately standing for what they believe in a space that is, yes, around safety, yes, around community, and how do we integrate sort of those to be things that people really believe are one and the same. And we can do that with programs where we empower community, sort of NGOs or otherwise, to be, sort of give out helmets or be part of that process of education and safety campaigns. And that's really what we try and do by localizing and integrating into a city footprint.
And Minal, you talked on this a little bit about working at Uber in the early days. I mean, I feel like, and not just Lime, it's all the mobility companies, ride-sharing, scooters, bikes. It's always been about, I think, asking for forgiveness instead of begging for permission. That's usually been the model in the early days, and now it's shifting. And do you, I mean, you're investing in a company in Asia that's doing scooters. I mean, do you think now startups out of the gate are saying, we see what's happened to the more established players, and we need to more proactively work with regulators and governments from the very get-go?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to our panelists' point, that's very much happening, more so now, where scooter companies and bike sharing companies are looking at how they can provide benefit not only to the rider community, but to the non-rider community, to the broader community. I mean, you have one scooter company, for instance, I think it's Bird, who's actually trying to make scooters more affordable for people on public housing, food stamps. You have Lime working with the city of Santa Monica to try and create more, protected bike lanes. I think the scooter companies are involved in a lot more initiatives to work with local government than the ride-sharing companies were previously.
Cool. I should mention, if you want to submit questions, we'll try to take some towards the end in the Slido part of the Web Summit app. If you scroll over to your profile, there's a place to enter questions. They'll show up here, and we'll try to get to those. So I want to talk also just about safety. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit already. You've got the helmet right there. Is it as simple as attaching helmets to these things? Is that how we're going to get there to where everyone actually wears a helmet? Because I know all these scooter companies, including Lime, say you have to wear a helmet, but no one actually wears a helmet. I mean, we've seen everyone on Lime, even here in Lisbon, running. Like, people don't wear helmets. So how is that going to get? How are we going to get there? And how are you guys thinking about that?
The ultimate we see as a systemic problem that you have to take on from all angles. And yes, helmets and behavior and education is a key part of that. But so is understanding how we can work with cities to take our data and say, Miguel, how do we figure out what the best and safest place it is for you to ride a bike? Where do we ultimately figure out how to create additional lanes or block off lanes and make them full alternative mobility lanes? I think the sort of working at multiple angles to use tech to its best effect. For instance, now in certain areas in Prague, where there are high sort of foot density or foot traffic zones, we don't let you go at all, or the motor cuts off. We have now, after certain times of night in certain areas, the scooter's speed immediately decreases. So there's lots of things that we can do from the technology perspective, from the infrastructure perspective, as well as the behavior and education perspective. I mean, this space is so new that people still don't even understand sort of how to best leverage it, how to use it. And I think as we really create sort of a win-win platform of conversation between cities and providers, that we're going to come to a medium which really helps this become a change for our cities.
Miguel, how does Lisbon think about that in terms of infrastructure, in terms of needing to have that?
I think there are two sides of it, of course. There is the environment, there is the infrastructure, the environment, the infrastructure, and the user. If you look to the infrastructure, cities have a role. And in the city of Lisbon, in less than 10 years, we more than double the movements on pedestrians and bicycles and now scooters, because we changed the profile of the city. In the many roads, there was 70% of space for the car. Today it's 40%, and we create space for bicycles and for pedestrians. And when we create those space, people occupy that space. Sometimes it takes too much time, because it's just slow changing the city. And maybe we can be more aggressive using more radical changes of the public space just to create a protected area for bicycles and scooters, and we are considering to do that here in Lisbon also. But regarding the environment and regarding the user, just because a scooter has a throttle, it doesn't mean you have to go full throttle. And sometimes the users forget that, and we have a lot of things to be done that people behave in a different way and respect themselves. And I'm speaking about pedestrians that walk on cycle paths, and I'm speaking about scooters that walk on sidewalks, and people have to understand how to behave in the society, and it's something to be changed. Lime here in Lisbon says you have to be over 18 to use the scooters. We see kids with 14 and 13 using the scooters. Something has to be done also at home to give them different behavior. And so changing the users, it's tough. We have to look to the right incentives, but it's not everything on the city side. So, and regarding the users, each user has to make its own options, and we have to inform them to do better options, but also operators like Lime have a role to change behavior.
Okay, we're going to answer here. We got some good questions coming in. There was one about monetization and how does the business get built. Minal, maybe you can speak to this first, and then Caen. They mentioned data or ads, which getting an ad while I'm riding a scooter sounds like the worst thing in the world. But is it just enough to do the current system, which is just pay per ride, or is there going to be a subscription model? Is it a data play? How do you think about it as an investor?
Yeah, I mean, I think several companies are looking at subscription models. In fact, I believe Lime was going to roll out Lime Prime, right?
We're in conversations.
In conversations. So I definitely think subscription models are going to be happening, monthly subscription models, maybe with some free ride credits and so on. I think there is a question of the geo data that the scooter companies are collecting. How is that going to be used? Will that information be licensed in some way to cities? You know, there's some potential there as well. But yeah, I'll let you speak to it as well. In terms of the economics.
Sure. I mean, high-level unit economics of the scooter business are strong to the point where we can ultimately continue to R&D into this space and invest into capital-intensive business that we know it's about behavior change. That what we are sort of beginning to just touch the tip of the iceberg of is people using this not only to think of it as a weekend activity or as an occasional ride when I last minute forgot something, but as day in and day out actually transforming the way they get around. That we'll actually see public transportation, for instance, usage grow as we see people use these more, because they're built for those transportation deserts that get you to a light rail or get you to a bus stop, then get you downtown, that get you that bus stop to your office. And so we ultimately see sort of our ability to really build into the behavior and build the pie. When we consider the fact that most U.S. cities are under 1% of alternative mobility solution, we're less competing against others and more trying to grow the overall alternative mobility pie that exists.
I will also add on unit economics. I mean, the unit economics on scooters is fantastic, arguably better than ride sharing.
It's Uber without the driver, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, roughly, you know, you're kind of getting your money back in terms of what was invested in terms of original costs plus depreciation and whatnot on each scooter within, I would say, a couple of months is what we're all calculating, which is very, very quick. And then everything after that is profit, right? So the unit economics are great. I think the regulatory costs, because a lot of companies are getting hit with cease and desist lawsuits. Portland, for instance, is now has implemented a 25-cent surcharge. Plus increased permit fees. You know, those are costs that I don't think we have a clear understanding of how much they're going to impact unit economics. And so I do think from a VC standpoint, as somebody investing in scooter companies, that continues to remain an open issue. And on safety, you know, I think the concern from our perspective, from an investor perspective, is it's kind of a race to the bottom on pricing. I think eventually it might be because you have several companies that are providing a similar service. Right now, I think everyone's competing on quality and service and also ability to work with cities. I think eventually, though, it might become a price competition. And when you look at safety features and those kind of things, I think the worry becomes who's going to, it's almost like a, you know, we're worried that we don't want to get into a situation where we're playing chicken, where no one wants to pull the trigger first in terms of implementing additional safety precautions or things that might add expense in order to make scooters safer. Whether it's a safety fee on each user, each rider, or anything like that. I think the concern is, are we going to compromise on safety to get the economics we need and get the critical user mass we need? So I think from a VC standpoint, that's something that we're looking at very carefully.
I also have a perspective on that, which might be a bit different, just to say this. Cities need public transport. The mobility of the future needs mass transit. If you look to a train takes 1,000 people, which is 1,000 scooters, which is 800 cars. So a shared car cannot replace public transport. Uber cannot replace public transport. Uber Pool cannot replace Uber transport. Of course, but public transport need these new modes to be more attractive and work together to actually offer an alternative to the private car. So, but cities are very often, and governments are very often also stakeholders and public transport companies. And when you see someone entering your market in an unregulated way, taking you the best part of the market, and just leaving the public service to the cities without the revenue of the best part, you have a financial problem, and cities will react. So what I think right now we are still in the stage that we have to help all these modes to grow. But very quickly, we should find a way to put the products together so that people can actually opt for the best options. Either it's public transport, scooters, cars, whatever, to have a package of solutions that in the perspective of mobility as a service. But don't make these new modes compete for the public transport, because that will unbalance the system, and the system still transports, in a city like Lisbon, 800,000 people every day that need to be transported. So we cannot unbalance it. So we need to find ways to join the products, to make them complementary, and actually fight for a space with the car, which has a bigger budget, but not compete between alternative modes, soft modes, and public transport. We have to find ways to do so.
I couldn't agree more. I think in many ways we're doing that actively and working with you all, understanding already just from the numbers, we're seeing public transportation grow because of the effect of our average distance and what that allows you to do in sort of making public transport more easy for you to bake into your daily life. I think we've also done programs for some parents. We've actually integrated in with the train station there, where we have designated spots that get replenished at different times of day. So as you're coming in, you know where to pick them up and drop them off. And I think the more that we can interweave the sort of nature of hotspots for these last mile situations being right around public transport, the more we can create that sort of sense of fluidity that really is multimodal. And that also goes back to the other point, is that I think multimodal is a different way of looking at the space than just scooters. And I think some companies are just one particular vehicle type, and then it does become, I think, a game of simply like pricing to the lowest on that. But when you're offering a platform as a service, that's when you can do things like a subscription, which allows for you to have access to our electric cars, to our electric bikes, to our electric scooters, or whatever else we create that sort of is solving that urban landscape problem. And it empowers you in a way where what you're doing is having a hassle-free, on-demand, sort of easy way for you to always navigate around town. And I think that is what sort of this generation that is trying to understand how to move into cities, how to grow into cities, how to have less on top of sort of their overhead as they're making cities work, that all of that is a sort of part of the solution that Lime bakes in and works with all sort of stakeholders to really understand their needs.
Okay, so 2 last questions from the audience. I'm glad you brought up different types of ways of getting around. People want to know Lime's expansion plans for Europe, and are you looking at other vehicles? There's been reports about some kind of car. I mean, what are you looking at?
So car is a yes. I announced it, I think, 2 weeks ago in Vegas at a JD Power event. So we are going into an electric car fleet. Our fleet is electric. That's sort of one of the things that we're creating as the future, is that you don't necessarily need to have the speed at which a city can build infrastructure for electric to be able to provide the city electric mobility options. And so we've already done that and proven that with scooters. We plan to continue to prove that with cars. Probably more appropriately unveil it in what is January or so of next year, with the idea being we'll begin to roll that out in markets across Europe as well as in North America.
And for the scooter business now in Europe, are you still doing an aggressive expansion in Europe? Is that the plan?
We're definitely seeing this as an opportunity to create a European-wide network. We want you to be able to go to any particular city and feel as though you can, for now, access our scooters, and over time be able to access any of our vehicles under a unified experience.
All right, that's great. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you guys so much for watching, and thanks to our panelists. Thank you.